Stories of an aircraft builder. German aviation magazine called FLUGZEUG. An article written by Peter W. Cohausz. The Fokker triplane in the home garden. A replica Fokker DR1 is actually nothing special, especially as there are now over 60 replicas worldwide, some of which are rather less accurate. However, when an 18-year-old student with no previous knowledge of aircraft construction dares to build a replica after lengthy research, and the result is one of the most accurate reconstructions of the legendary triplane to date, then this is a remarkable piece of youth studies. In 1988, 16-year-old Achim Engels from the Swabian town of Schorndorf enthusiastically leafed through an issue of the Aero anthology and studied with fascination a phantom drawing and a 3-page view of Fokker DR1 with the construction number 152-17. Manfred von Richthofen had flown this aircraft for several weeks at the beginning of March 1918. With its red upper wing, engine cowling, rear fuselage and wheels, the otherwise dark green and light green painted aircraft looked quite decorative. As Achim already had some experience in plastic model making, he had the idea of building a remote control model on a scale of 1/6, which was to be as true to the original as possible. On the basis of the drawings in Aero, he began to draw plans for the construction of the model. The first doubts about historical accuracy of the sources soon arose. Missing details prompted him to search for more accurate models. The Deutsches Museum, Shuttleworth Collection, Imperial War Museum and other institutions were contacted. The answers were rather mager, except for a suggestion to try Leonard E. Opdyke, the editor of a magazine called World War I Aero, a specialists magazine published by a number of aviation historians, museums and aircraft manufacturers and home builders in the USA. Meanwhile, the 1/6 scale model construction began. When the fuselage framework was finished, he realized that building this aircraft in its original size would certainly not be much more difficult. Acquaintances, friends and relatives were horrified and amused. Too young, no vocational training, no knowledge of aircraft construction, dreamer, weirdos, etc., they said. Achim was undeterred and began to do some research. The Fokker factory, museums and private individuals received mail from him. With the knowledge he gained, he began to draw plans for every detail of the triplane. By mid-1990, he had produced over 40 DNA 2 sheets, which he painstakingly and meticulously produced night after night. The scales were 1/20, 1/10, 1/5 or 1/1, depending on the available sources or the size of the respective component. The trigger for this painstaking work was the advice of the aviation historian at the Fokker factory. Let's look at the matter soberly. What you are doing is superfluous, because the same work has already been done by an American called Ron Sands, and these plans are the absolute. This advice was a challenge, especially as it became increasingly clear during later research that these highly praised plans contained a number of concessions to today's construction and certification regulations and should therefore also enable less experienced aircraft builders to recreate a Fokker DR1 that comes relatively close to the original. When comparing the American drawings, which were actually very nicely presented, with historical photos, contradictions soon became apparent. For example, there are differences in the shape of the rear of the fuselage, the engine mounts, the engine cowlings, mostly designed for today's radial engines, or the shape of the turtle decks and other plywood fairings. Some of the deviations are probably due to legal clauses contained in the American drawings. Every replica made according to these drawings should be recognizable as such from the outside. Achim's aim was to produce drawings that were as authentic and historically verifiable as possible. The most important basis for this was a report from a magazine called FLUGZEUG of 1918, which contained many detailed drawings of the Fokker DR1. The report originally came from the British magazine Flight from May 1918 and was translated by FLUGZEUG, and its source was none other than the Ministry of Ammunition, which had led the investigation into the almost intact aircraft captured by the British, flown by Lieutenant von Stapenhorst. It was 144-17. FLUGZEUG was even able to correct some of the British politically colored statements. In addition to this extremely rich source, Achim was able to use some fragments of original factory drawings which the Fokker factory or some private collectors had given him as copies. These also included drawings from the strength testing department, which had compared the wings of the early and later Fokker DR1 at the end of 1917, and a construction description by the Eatfleet from November of 1917. A visit to the Deutsches Museum also helped. Various measurements were taken from the Fokker D7 on display there, as some details allowed conclusions to be drawn about the DR1. In August 1990, Achim corresponded with several museums in an attempt to obtain further documents. At the same time, he offered to produce a historically accurate replica. After several preliminary discussions, during which he presented the first drawings, the Order and Technik Museum at Sinsheim showed interest and practically gave the order for a replica. This also secured the financing. Construction of this began in November 1990. The main helpers from the circle of friends were Wolfgang Schuster, who was the same age, and Achim's girlfriend Renate Wager. After a lengthy search throughout southern Germany, the material was secured and a sufficiently large space was found. The upper wing measured at least 7 by 1 meters. Work began on the second floor of a barn crammed with all kinds of materials that was useless for a Fokker. Well, mostly. The supporting structure was the first step. This means the wings. 3 spars, around 60 ribs. The fittings and the uncovered wings were made in the back room of Achim's father's electrical components store before the parts were driven at walking pace through Schondorf on the roof rack of a Ford Fiesta to the barn 3 kilometers away. Templates and auxiliary tools had to be devised and built for the construction. A roller with steel pins to mark the positions of the nails on the spar, a jigsaw to cut grooves, templates for the ribs, and so on. After 4 months and countless hours, the wing was finished. Achim's daily routine during this time was as follows: 7 AM to 1 PM school, then building the airplane in the barn until dusk, and then working on the drawings while helping out in his father's electrical store. In March of 1991 they worked on the fittings, carried out wood preservation work, and welded the fuselage frame together. A self-designed jig facilitated the work. Welding was carried out using oxyacetylene, just like in the Fokker factories in the past. Friendly craftsmen contributed difficult sheet metal parts such as the tank, ammunition boxes, and the engine cowling. The fuselage was built in Wolfgang Schuster's parents' garage, as the barn was not suitable for work with open fire. In June 1991, the fuselage was transported to the barn, again on the roof rack of the Ford Fiesta, and several night shifts were put in because an employee of the Order and Technik Museum wanted to take a look at the construction progress. As the reproduction was to be as authentic as possible, attention was also paid to seemingly insignificant details such as the wrapping of the fuselage and tail steel tubes with canvas strips. This was necessary in order to be able to glue on the fabric covering with a varnish used in 1917. With the dope and adhesive paints used today, the covering could also be glued directly to the tubes, which is why this detail is missing on most replica Fokker DR1 models. In the fall of 1991, Achim and Wolfgang began covering the aircraft. In order to gain experience, they first covered small surfaces such as the control surfaces and then the fuselage and wings. The workshop Practice for the Construction of Gliders, a brochure from the 1930s, served as a technical literature. The reconstruction of the paintwork was laborious. Here one could only rely on old flight reports and black and white photographs. This resulted in the following paint scheme for the Fokker DR1 with the construction number 15217. The undersides of the fuselage and wing were light blue-gray. On the upper sides, light blue-gray and dark green were painted on in coarse stripes present a streaky camouflage paint pattern, so that together with the linen-colored covering material a three-colored camouflage paint resulted. The red engine cowling, the wheels, the rear of the fuselage and the top of the upper wing formed a strong contrast to this. Although historians are still arguing about the above-mentioned three-tone paint job, the camouflage effect was impressively confirmed during the later assembly in the garden of Wolfgang's parents' house. In April 1992, the aircraft was nearing completion with the construction of the undercarriage. The search for suitable wheels was incredibly lucky. An old fire engine was found in the chaos of the barn. Its wheels were exactly the right size, diameter, number of spokes and shape. Everything was perfect. The only flaw was the tread on the tires. The final assembly took place in Wolfgang's garden at the beginning of June 1992. The barn was no longer available. Of course, the Fokker was the attraction of the neighborhood and for the press in Schorndorf and the surrounding area. Since June 13th, 1992, the triplane can be admired in the Technik Museum in Speyer. Achim still has to deliver a replica of the propeller and engine as dummies. The museum is responsible for procuring the armament. This marked the end of a turbulent time for Achim and his friends. They still want to improve a few details, such as painting over the wide areas around the iron crosses, as a recently published photograph shows construction number 152-17 without these areas. They were subsequently painted over at the time. Achim Engels sees his reconstructed Fokker as a basis for discussion for aviation historians, as not all details could be clearly reconstructed. With the new insight he has gained, he would one day like to produce an improved, even more authentic replica. His dream is to have his own workshop for aircraft restorations. Until then, he would like to recreate more historic aircraft on behalf of museums.